Achaemenid Persia was one of the most powerful ancient empires in the world, spreading from the Indus River in the east to the Bosphorus Sea in the west. Under Cyrus the Great, it was the most powerful state in the world with the possible exception of Zhou China. Regardless, under the reign of Darius the Great, the Persians would come into conflict with the Hellenic cities of ancient Greece, but failed to subdue the region despite their numerical and even diplomatic advantage over the upstart Athenians and Spartans. From there, their westward expansion would halt at the shores of Anatolia, though their ties to the Greek world were far from severed, as they spent the next several decades navigating the shifting alliances of the Polis system, and as the empire declined, it was ended by none other than Alexander the Great, king of the Macedonian Kingdom that had united Greece for the first time under his father, Philip II. However, this begs the question, what if Persia had successfully conquered Greece? Well, to answer that question, we both need to know why the wars happened and why the Persians lost. The main reason for Persian expansionism into Greece is the Ionian Revolt in 499 BC, wherein the recently democratized Athens supported Ionian Greek cities in their revolts against Persian governors, which naturally caused the Persian Empire to be very mad at Athens. Emperor Darius then sent an army under his son-in-law Mardonius to demand tribute of all the Greek cities and reconquer Thrace. All but Athens and Sparta submitted, with the exception of Naxos, because Naxos was destroyed. However, the campaign into Attica failed to subdue Greece due to the Battle of Marathon, in which the Persians were unable to field their cavalry due to the hills and marshes surrounding the valley, and the hoplite army of Athens massacred the lightly armored Persians. Darius originally intended a second full-scale invasion, but a revolt in Egypt led to this being postponed until his successor Xerxes came to power. Xerxes was the one who oversaw the 480 Battle of Thermopylae, but his invasion was ultimately defeated at sea with the Battle of Salamis, which ended the Persian ability to control the sea and their logistics. The Persians were driven from Greek shores within a year, despite occupying most of Greece to that point. So what's our point of divergence? Simple. We have the Persians maintain control over the maritime war. We can't use the Battle of Salamis itself because the entire point of the battle was a Greek trap to draw Persia into close quarters where the massive empire's navy wouldn't actually be able to coordinate. However, the Battle of Artemisium seems like a good shot. The Greeks brought about 270 ships to bear versus the Persians 1,200. Despite this, the Greeks only lost about 100 ships versus the Persians losing 400. The Allies vastly outperforming the Persians on this. However, the main naval doctrine of the era probably involved sailing into gaps in enemy lines and ramming into the sides. While this would have been advantageous to the Persians due to their greater mobility and sheer numbers, the Greek coalition negated this by approaching Artemisium in either a circular or crescent shape, negating the mobility advantage and their ability to flank the Greeks. If we just have the Greeks not get this idea, the Persians win and the Greek strategy, which required holding both Thermopylae and Artemisium, falls apart. As a result, most of the Greek allies would surrender, with the exception of Sparta. Athens, however, is already under Persian occupation. As a result, with all of Greece under Persian control and the larger city destroyed or occupied, the Persian conquest of Sparta is a formality. Plenty of Greeks are sold into slavery all over the empire, both for economic reasons and to weaken resistance throughout the area. The conquest of Greece is over, but now what remains is the integration. Of Persia's allies in Greece, Thebes is probably the largest and most prestigious, and thus is likely promoted to control the Storapi of Hellas. Going by the government of Ionia, a large and prominent Storapi, Thebes is then likely to appoint city-level governments made up of locals, which may or may not be called tyrants. While the occupation will be disliked, and the Persians will have to put down quite a few revolts in the first few years, I think they could probably hold the area. After all, they now have much friendlier logistics, and the Greek disunity would be their undoing in any subsequent revolts. There wouldn't be any force calling for a restoration of an independent Greece, but an independent city-state. At least, that would be the case early on. As time goes on, the increased unity from the Theban administration and the Persian imperialism will likely create a stronger notion of what it means to be Greek. It's also worth noting that the ancient Greek cities had colonies all over the Mediterranean, and over the next several decades, many would likely flee to these colonies. In fact, this has massive consequences for the rest of the Mediterranean. With Greeks pouring into colonies all over the place, Roman ascendance in Italy is likely butterflied away as new cities are either built, old ones invade their weakened neighbors, or these refugees become pirates who eventually get lucky and take the small city-state. Carthage likely handles this crisis better, already being an established power throughout the region, while Rome at this point is just getting off the ground militarily. However, we'll come back to the Mediterranean as a whole later, after the decline of the Achaemenid Persians. Admittedly, with one exception surrounding the immediate decline of the dynasty, this video is going to be very heavy on broad, decades-long trends, and won't get into specific details of any of the states we discussed because ancient history is very fluid and frankly not really my forte. Now, I do want to point out that Greek culture likely won't be suppressed by Persia, even if decades of increased political cohesion likely wear down some of the regional quirks. As a rule, the Achaemenid Persians were relatively tolerant of allowing native religion and culture to survive. Cyrus famously allowed the creation of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, he legitimized his rule in Babylon by taking on neglected religious rituals, and later emperors even took on the title of Pharaoh of Egypt. In fact, even without the conquest, there were already Greeks in the Persian Empire. They were the Ionians whose revolt started this whole mess in the first place. Hell, there were even some deep into Iran, helping build palaces like in Susa. In fact, Wikipedia claims that Greek was something of a bureaucratic language in the empire, where Olam and Aramaic were the lingua francas. So it seems likely to me that Greek culture, at least the Central Greek region and Aeolic dialect spoken in places like Thebes, would remain relevant and possibly even flourish. Interestingly, this Greek unity might not exist on the other side of the Aegean, since western Anatolia was mostly Ionian, which was closer to the now destroyed Athens. While these differences could be overcome, since they are all still speaking versions of the same language while living in the same empire without that extra level of political unity, I could see the differences remaining more pronounced. In our timeline, after the defeat in Greece, the Persians adopted a different strategy. Under Artaxerxes and subsequent Shahs, they would intervene in Greek politics without waging wars of conquest. For example, when Themistocles, who was instrumental to the Persian defeat in our timeline, was exiled from Athens, Persia decided to make him the governor of Magnesia, part of the Anatolian coast on the frontier. However, here this dynamic is entirely butterflied, and this is one of the trickiest parts of the video to predict. Hell, Persia didn't even really expand into other parts of the world due to political instability. Egypt was constantly revolting. And like I said, I think that Greece would remain an unstable territory like Egypt, but that its history of disunity would keep them too weak to successfully revolt. Now, even as the Persian Empire was playing benefactor and kingmaker in Greek politics after the war, they were going through a period of cultural evolution. Though, to be fair, most cultures are ever evolving. Around the reign of Artaxerxes, Zoroastrianism began to spread throughout most of the Iranian plateau and eastern Anatolia. Here, while we can't know for certain, it does seem very plausible to me that Zoroastrianism begins to spread among the elites of Greece and the Western Empire, which has all sorts of ramifications for the very notion of Western religion that I'm not prepared to assess in the slightest. Going mostly by Encyclopedia Britannica, Zoroastrianism was a quasi-monotheistic religion, wherein Ahura Mazda is the embodiment of goodness, who will inevitably triumph over Angra Mainyu, his dualistic counterpart that controls evil. They postulate that the world was once pure and good, and after the inevitable victory of Mazda, will be so again. It's a very dualistic faith with a lot of intricacies that I don't feel qualified to comment on, especially since it wasn't completely compiled until the Sasanians during the reign of Khosrow in the 500s AD. It's entirely likely that the religion evolves in a very different way, entirely due to different power players being at different theological debates and different reforms being made. While Persia was not dogmatic in spreading its religion, my thinking is that Theban merchants and aristocracy, those who benefit from the increased ties to Persia, would begin to spread the religion around. And ultimately, while we won't be messing with the Persian imperial family too much, the Greek nobility will spend plenty of time throughout the Persian Empire, educating their children in places like Persepolis and Octobana, further tying these groups together. While initially it would be mostly syncretic, there will certainly be more than a few nobles who just lean fully into Zoroastrianism, which could lead to institutional favoritism. Now, a very big question for this video is the actual fate of the Persian Empire. While it was weakened by the time of Alexander's conquest, it is still likely too strong for Macedonia to actually take over Greece, let alone the entire empire, which did require the sheer plot armor of Alexander to pull off. In addition, Macedonia has actually been a vassal of the Persians the entire time, meaning that they're not just pushing to unify Greece, they're also trying to revolt against the mightiest empire on the planet, which is going to be a tough nut to crack when that very same empire will have troops ready and waiting to put that down. However, none of what we've actually done changes the Persian succession, which was becoming increasingly unstable in the decades following Artaxerxes. His own son was assassinated less than 2 months into ruling. The usurping half-brother made it about 6 months before another usurpier half-brother got to him. Darius II actually ruled the empire, making it 19 years, but what little we do know about the reign includes more than a few revolts. His successor, Artaxerxes II, faced his own share of revolts, including a 10-year-long series of uprisings by Serapis in the west that could also include the Greeks, and a successful Egyptian revolt, though he might do a little better in Egypt this time. While Greece would be in revolt early in Artaxerxes' reign, it would still be ill-coordinated and weak, unlike the Spartans that he actually faced. Regardless, from here we will go to Artaxerxes III, who was actually pretty solid, but unable to prevent the rise of Macedon. His son Arses was a puppet ruler, unable to free himself from the eunuch who called the shots, and was succeeded by Darius III, who fell to Alexander. Though props to Darius III, he did in fact manage to get rid of the eunuch. The point is, even without Alexander, Persia is starting to have problems. Egypt and Greece are near perpetual revolts, the Satrapies are becoming dangerously powerful and revolt with every new monarch, and frankly the empire's bureaucracy can't handle it. As a result, the Achaemenid Empire is likely to break down by the end of the 300s BC. Darius III probably manages to prevent an active collapse in a world without Alexander, but unless he or his son Ochus are extremely skilled peacetime administrators, which is a little unlikely at this point, the systemic issues are just going to keep bubbling up. Revolt, inflation, unstable core politics, they're all building and becoming more intense every few successions. Now, the actual breaking point of the empire is pretty uncertain. The Parthians are about 50 years out from the point I think would be the end of the road after all. Maybe it's a succession dispute, maybe it's a nomadic invasion Ochus just isn't able to snuff out, or another fucking Egyptian revolt. As a result, this map is a little arbitrary, by which I mean entirely arbitrary. Something else that might be worth considering is the Mauryan Empire. In our timeline, Chandragupta I founded the empire and came into a brief conflict with the Greek Serapis that established himself on the Indus River with Alexander's conquests. However, Maurya was active in the collapse of Macedon, even fighting a war with the Seleucids, who were one of the Diadochi who emerged after the death of Alexander, though in most aspects were a Hellenized Persian dynasty. Regardless, while Persia is in disarray and not yet on the rebound, I could see Indian powers taking advantage to invade western Pakistan or Afghanistan, which could have some serious consequences for the rest of Central Asia. Hell, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom doesn't exist, which completely changes the power dynamics of Central Asia as to who is in what position to invade or settle where. And that ambiguity is part of why I haven't actually talked about who takes power in Persia. Either way, the history of India and Persia is long and messy and a little past the Mediterranean scope of this video. Regardless, the Western Empire falls into warlordism. There's likely some sort of Theban Kingdom of Hellas, Western Anatolia is independent, and Egypt and whoever takes over the Iranian plateau are fighting over Mesopotamia. It's almost like the Hellenistic age, but I actually think the power dynamics work in Theban favor this time around, or at least it's unlikely to go quite as badly. See, when Alex died in 323, Macedon remained in control over Greece, but would come into conflict with the rising Rome, and from the 200s on would be picked apart. However, here there is no Rome. There's only Thebes and Magna Graecia, as well as the other Persianid states in Anatolia and Egypt. As a result, I think that Thebes might be in a good position to expand, while Lydia and Italy are weak and disunited, and it quickly becomes home to a Theban empire, much bigger and better than anything Athens or Sparta could have dreamed of. Over the next several decades, Thebes would come into conflict with the Phoenicians over Italy, the Egyptians and the Iranians over Anatolia, and of course, the people they're trying to conquer. Now, I'll admit, maybe this is Western bias speaking, or the fact that it lets me map paint, but I think that Thebes would have a chance at coming out on top of these rivalries. Thebes, with a Persian military tradition and a history as the center of their maritime world, would likely have a decent chance against Carthage, though like with Rome, it would be quite a power struggle, even more pronounced here due to the naval theater involved for both. As a result, it is a multi-generational conflict over Italy and even the Greek islands, and honestly, it isn't likely to end with either side completely destroyed. The Greeks are a lot farther from Tunisia than the Romans were and probably care more about dealing with Persia or Egypt than Africa. In effect, they have the geopolitical interests of the Byzantines. Yeah, sure, North Africa is nice, but Italy was the actual threat in the west, and now Persia and Egypt are threats in the east. You get the point I'm trying to make. By this world's versions of the 160s BC or so, the Theban Empire is likely in control of Anatolia and Italy, and is likely entered into conflict with Egypt or Persia. Now, these conflicts are unlikely to bear much, if any, resemblance to our timeline. The Romans conquered Egypt largely because of the sheer chaos in both political situations. Regardless, the Near East is likely a power struggle between Thebans, Egyptians, and Persians, and honestly, it's a toss-up who wins. The power dynamics between each state are incredibly different than the ones that existed between Rome, Parthia, and Egypt, since the Ptolemaic Kingdom wasn't exactly the best period in ancient Egypt. Either way, we're going to roll a dice to see which faction wins, 1 through 3 being Greece, Egypt, or Persia, and 4 being none of them. Well, none of them went out and destroyed the others, or at least not until well after this point. The thing is, none of these societies will last forever, one of them will collapse and the other two will feast like carrion. Regardless, the mutually assured destruction means that the wars among all 3 of them will be relatively limited. The frontier zone will be somewhere around Syria and Iraq, and it will be a constant battleground for decades to centuries. The empires will generally ebb and flow, with places as far as Ankara as seeing battle during particularly brutal wars, but throughout the period, the 3 are generally peers in terms of economic and military might, each with a slight edge. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the show, please consider a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and if you're already subscribed and want to support me in other ways and get perks like early videos and shoutouts at the end of the video, consider becoming a channel member as well. Thank you. Now, I don't want to turn this into the Thebes video, so what's up with Persia? Well, the problem is that it's hard to say without knowing the exact reasons the Achaemenid collapsed. I kind of just looked at the trends of messy succession and made an educated guess. Regardless, Iran is a region where empire becomes very easy. Keeping it is the hard part. Regardless, while Thebes is beating up the Italians, Persia, whoever it is, will be spending that time fighting the Anatolians and the Egyptians. In general, I think that Egypt is the weakest of the 3 great powers to emerge from the Achaemenid collapse, but it would probably still resist collapse for a good long time. Persia likely also snipes land off the Thebans whenever they're getting too distracted in Italy or North Africa, but I don't necessarily know what those borders look like. Something else to note is that while in our world we consider Greece the heart of Western civilization, or at least the cornerstone under a Roman foundation, that really wouldn't apply here. Thebes in this world is a Zoroastrian state with a Greek syllabic writing system for either a highly divergent form of Greek or an Aramaic descended language. What does it have in common with the pagans of Gaul or North Africa with the Phoenician alphabet? Hell, religiously, the pagans are closer together despite Carthage not being Indo-European just due to paganism being easier to syncretize with. In contrast, Thebes, Persia, and Egypt are all much closer together, even if Egypt likely isn't Zoroastrian since they did generally worship the Egyptian pantheon even through the pagan era of Roman rule. As a result, while Thebes probably has the potential to unite the Mediterranean, if it doesn't conquer Egypt, it has very little reason to. And even if it does, it probably still excludes Gaul and Iberia. In contrast, Persia likely doesn't care about the Mediterranean due to the relative distance. In fact, forget the dice roll. Let's just assume that after decades to a century of stalemate, Egypt finally breaks under the Persian hammer, and the empire is now able to focus mostly on Central Asia and Anatolia. This is, frankly, very bad news for Thebes. While a Persian-Carthaginian alliance is unlikely, it's honestly not necessary. Persia is just stronger than Thebes at this point, and is likely able to conquer most of Anatolia, possibly even reclaiming the province of Greece. From here, Western civilization is functionally split between the Celto-Phoenicians in the far western Mediterranean, and the Persianized, Zoroastrian-dominated empires in the Near East, with a blurry frontier in Italy and Egypt acting as a third pillar. In effect, there is no broader Western culture, at least not one that sees a continent worshipping the legacy of an ancestral empire like Rome. And frankly, the Punic Celts in the west will also have weaker bonds, since Carthage wasn't a continental power with a unified empire like Rome or Persia. It was a collection of trading outposts and colonies that broadly answered to the same city. As a result, unless they take over Iberia and the subsequent gold allows for a noble family to pull a Caesar and centralize the state, admittedly not very unlikely, then the Carthaginian legacy just won't match our world's Rome. While it's possible that some Carthaginian colony in Gaul goes on to conquer the rest of the region and become a pseudo-Rome, I hesitate to employ that largely because it would be entirely fictional. With Phoenician culture syncretizing with the Celts, we only have a very limited idea as to what that would entail. In addition, while Gaul didn't necessarily have these big, sprawling cities, it was home to very powerful tribes and leagues capable of projecting power on a larger scale than a single colony. There's a reason that Rome didn't subdue the core of the region until they'd already taken over nearly everything else. If anything, it will be the more Hellenistic cities in Italy or the Carthaginian colonies in Iberia that go on to become empires in their own right after the fall of Carthage. Iberia cities will be conquered by Celtic groups, sure, but at least some cities and broader political organization seems likely to survive and potentially expand in the centuries after the collapse. It occurs to me that without a Roman Empire in the West to prevent the restoration of Persian ascendancy, Persia will almost become akin to China. What I mean is that even in our world, various Persian empires would emerge in roughly the same location, drawing on the legacy and administration that came before, which to be fair is similar to what others did with Rome LARP. However, unlike how Rome was dead and buried without ever being resurrected territorially, the Persian cornerstone will almost always bounce back with its core of the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia and Anatolia becoming world-renowned centers of culture, education, and wealth. Greece will be a province similar to Korea, not always part of every single version of the empire, but very culturally similar and economically integrated, often as a tributary state with nominal independence. China would be much more populated, and the Persian empires are going to have fiercer competition between the Indian states in the east and the Punics in the west. In addition, while Persia will have its periods of disunity, it will also be easier to reunite, since the plateau generally enables mobile conquest, which facilitated the caliphates and many Central Asian nomads. In contrast, China is so utterly massive that it often took decades to fully subdue. Now, in case it wasn't obvious, Christianity does not exist in this world. While the Hebrews are still around, they're either under Persian or Egyptian occupation at the time of Christ, not Rome. Even with the fact that any individual we recognize is completely gone due to different migrations and wars, the fact is that the actual background of the church is tied to the Hellenistic period in Near Eastern culture and the revolts against Rome. As a result, the Mediterranean remains mostly pagan or Zoroastrian. While I think that Zoroastrian would have the institutional advantage, there were pagan communities in Roman territory up until at least Justinian, and even centuries after the Islamic conquest, there were places like Iberia and Anatolia with very large Christian populations. As a result, the religious framework of the Mediterranean and Near East remains more similar to the classical makeup it had, at least compared to our timeline where Christianity and Islam basically took over the entire world. Now, unfortunately, I think I need to end the scenario here. This is by far the most alien world I've constructed so far, and it's difficult to really compare anything to our timeline. We've explored the rise and fall of Aechamenid Persia, the spread of Zoroastrianism into continental Europe, and the brief but important Theban Empire. The Mediterranean is split between the Zoroastrians in Greece and Persia, and the Punic descendants in traditionally Celtic Europe. The world as a whole is incomprehensibly different to our own, with potential ramifications as far as Britain and India. The Abrahamic canon is likely confined to Judaism, while the West remains much more tied to its pagan roots. Before we go, I want to give a thank you to channel members Tim Fredibold and Marcellus Doretta for donating monthly. The support really means a lot, and I appreciate every little bit. However, with that, I think that's our time. Thank you for watching, and have an amazing day. Tune in next time to explore another alternate world.